Back, everyone. We're about to take a deep dive into something that's sure to get your taste buds tingling 18th century candy.
Oh, yeah. This is a fun one.
Today, we're exploring a YouTube video. You guessed it. It's from Townsend's, and it's titled Candy in the 18th Century.
Townsend's always does such a great job with these historical food videos.
Totally. And what's really fascinating about this one is we're not just looking at those old-timey sweets, but also uncovering how candy was tied to medicine and even, get this, food preservation.
You know, it really is fascinating how intertwined those things were back then. You know, we think of candy now as like a pure treat just for fun, but in the 18th century, it had all these different purposes.
Okay, so help us unpack this a bit. We tend to think of candy as, purely for pleasure, right? But the video mentions these things called electuaries. They're basically medicinal lollipops. It's like the ultimate spoonful of sugar to help the medicine go down, right?
Exactly. And some flavors that we associate with candy today, like, say, gingerbread, were originally considered medicinal.
Wait, gingerbread? As medicine, I'm picturing those cute little gingerbread men, not something you take for a cough or something.
Well, yeah, back then, gingerbread was this really dense, spicy, it said it was almost asphalt-like in the video. Not exactly the sweet treat we know and love today.
Wow, talk about a transformation. So how did those medicinal flavors evolve into purely, pleasurable treats?
It was a gradual process, right? As people started actually enjoying the taste, that medicinal purpose kind of faded away. What's really interesting is that there's this 18th century medical text. It's called The History of Drugs. It actually lists all these sugar-coated items, things like coriander nonpareil, right alongside regular medicines.
Wow, that's such a clear example of how intertwined those two worlds were back then. It's like they were deliberately using sugar to make the medicine, go down easier.
Right, exactly.
But speaking of sugar, the video also makes this really interesting connection between candy and food preservation.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Can you kind of explain that a bit more?
Sure. You know, a lot of the candies we enjoy today actually evolved from those very preservation techniques. Think about dried fruit, for example. Drying that fruit, that process concentrates the natural sugars and helps prevent, spoilage.
Okay, so they were basically unintentionally creating candy while trying to preserve food.
Well, in a way, yes. They were masters of preservation, and those skills, without necessarily intending to, led to the creation of these long-lasting treats.
That's really clever. And a great example of this, right, is honey. I mean, honey has this incredible shelf life due to the high sugar content and low moisture.
Exactly. And confectioners back then were basically using those same principles, boiling sugar, drying ingredients, to make these candies that could last.
That's so cool. And speaking of preserving flavors, the video highlights candied citrus peel, like candied orange or lemon peel, as a really common 18th century confection.
Oh yeah, candied citrus peel is such a great example. They'd soak the peel in water for days, to remove the bitterness, and then they'd boil it in this sugar syrup until it was translucent.
It sounds so simple, but so ingenious at the same time. And when you think about it, preserving those citrus fruits meant that they could enjoy those bright flavors year-round.
Right.
And the video host even does a taste test, describing how the flavors are preserved even months later.
That's something we totally take for granted today with our refrigerators and everything, but imagine how valuable that would have been in the 18th century.
Absolutely. It's like having a burst of sunshine in the middle of winter. Okay, so we've talked about medicine and preservation, but what about the king of all candy, chocolate? Did chocolate even exist back then?
It did. Chocolate does make an appearance in the 18th century, but not in the dominant candy form we know today.
Ah, okay.
It was mainly consumed as a hot beverage, competing with things like tea and coffee.
So not our beloved chocolate bars yet.
No, yeah.
But did it start evolving into a candy form at all during that time?
It did. The video mentions a recipe from an 18th century cookbook for something called chocolate puffs.
Chocolate puffs. Okay, so I'm picturing something kind of airy and light, like our modern cream puffs. Were they anything similar?
Not quite. Imagine a really dense chocolatey ball, and they're made with ground chocolate, sugar, and this rather unusual ingredient called gum dragon.
Gum dragon? What in the world is that?
It's a natural plant-based gum, sometimes also called tragacanth. They'd form this mixture into balls, bake them, and they would puff up. Creates a kind of crunchy exterior and a slightly chewy interior. And in the video, they do a taste test and describe this really distinct chocolate flavor and this unique texture.
Okay, so definitely not your average chocolate chip cookie.
Definitely not.
So how about hard candy? Was that even a thing back then?
Oh, yeah. Hard candy was actually very popular in the 18th century. And, you guessed it, it also had roots in medicine.
It seems like everything sweet started with medicine back then. But what kind of hard candy did they make? I'm having trouble picturing it.
So they had this thing called barley sugar, which was a simple hard candy made from, well, barley.
Barley sugar. I
Yeah.
never would have guessed. So were they just trying to be, like, healthy or something?
Not exactly. Barley actually acted as a natural substitute for what we now use corn syrup for. It provided these necessary inverted sugars to prevent the candy from crystallizing. And remember, corn syrup wasn't a thing back then.
Wait, hold on. Inverted sugars. I'm lost. What does that even mean?
Okay, so essentially, it's a type of sugar that helps prevent the hard candy from becoming grainy. Think of it like this. Regular sugar, when you boil it and cool it, can form those large, hard crystals, right?
Yeah. Okay.
But inverted sugar, like what they got from the barley, helps those crystals stay small, which results in that smooth, hard candy texture.
Oh, okay. So barley was their secret weapon for smooth, hard candy.
You got it.
Tell me about the process. Like, did they have, like, candy thermometers back then?
No, not even close. They were really going old school. They'd boil the barley to make this barley water, strain it, then add the sugar, and then boil it again, all while kind of monitoring the stages without a thermometer.
Wow, talk about skill. So they were literally boiling and eyeballing it.
Pretty much.
So what did the final product taste like?
Well, the video host describes it as this pure, almost stark caramel flavor. A world away from all those flavored hard candies we have today. Imagine, like, the aroma of caramelizing sugar right before it starts to burn.
Okay, I'm officially drooling. But before we get totally lost in that caramel aroma, the video mentions another kind of intriguing candy, something called clear cakes. What were those?
Clear cakes were basically a thick jelly candy, offering like a totally different kind of confectionery experience. The video focuses on a raspberry clear cake recipe from Mrs. Eel's cookbook.
Raspberry yum. So what went into these clear cakes? Was it like making jam?
Similar process. So they'd start by boiling the raspberries, to extract the juice, and then they'd add sugar and pectin to create that signature, thick jelly texture. What's interesting is that the original recipe actually calls for white currants as the pectin source, but those are like impossible to find today. So in the video, they actually substitute apple pectin.
Okay, apple pectin. That's something I can actually find in my pantry.
Right.
But what about the final product? How did they describe these clear cakes?
So the video host, they emphasize the really vibrant color and compare them to like gumdrops in terms of shape. And they dust the set jelly with sugar to prevent it from sticking.
Okay, so like gumdrops, I'm starting to get a visual here.
Yeah.
So did these clear cakes actually taste good?
They did a taste test and described this really intense burst of like fruit flavor balanced with that really satisfyingly thick jelly texture.
It's amazing to me how resourceful they were back then. Creating such a variety of candies with like limited ingredients and tools makes you wonder if any of our modern candies have these like surprising historical origins.
That is a great question. And speaking of surprising origins, let's move on to another really fascinating confection. Sugar plums.
Ooh, sugar plums. I always picture those shiny, round candies.
Yeah.
From 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. But I have a feeling that's not the whole story.
You're right, it's not. It's actually really fascinating how that term sugar plum has kind of evolved over time. In the 18th century, sugar plum didn't refer to like a specific candy. It was more of a whole category of sugar-coated delights.
Really?
Yeah.
So what exactly were they putting sugar on back then?
So think of it this way. Sugar plums were basically anything small and delicious that they could coat in sugar. And the history of drugs that we talked about earlier, it actually describes them as, and I'm quoting here, an infinite variety of flowers, seeds, berries, kernels, plums, and the like, which are by the confectioners covered with sugar.
So it was like the 18th century version of those assorted candy boxes. You never know what you're going to get.
That's a perfect analogy. And it really speaks to the ingenuity and resourcefulness of those early confectioners, right? They were using whatever ingredients they had available to create this like medley of sweet treats.
Okay, so we got sugar plums for like a surprise assortment of sweetness.
Yeah.
But what about something a little more, well, substantial? Did they have anything resembling our modern-day marzipan?
Oh, yeah. Marzipan is a great example. It actually has a really long history dating back to the Middle Ages, and it was a total beloved ingredient in 18th century confectionery.
Marzipan, that delicious almond paste. It always makes me think of, like, really fancy desserts.
Right.
How did they use it back then?
They used it for everything. It was so versatile. They could mold it into these intricate shapes, flavor it, color it, and it was naturally sweet from the almonds, which made it like a perfect base for candies.
So they were already making those elaborate marzipan figures and fruits that you still see today.
Exactly. It was like the 18th century version of edible art. And speaking of art, they even used marzipan to create these little miniature animals.
Wait, miniature marzipan animals? That is so adorable. I can just picture those tiny edible menageries.
I know, right? They were really pushing the boundaries of what you could do with sugar back then. And it wasn't just about satisfying like a sweet craving. It was about artistry, presentation, and even like social status.
That's a great point. It's like we're starting to understand how multifaceted the role of candy was in, like, 18th century society.
Right.
It wasn't just a simple treat. It reflected their values, their traditions, and even their relationship with food itself.
Exactly. And speaking of relationships with food, let's dive into some of the more, shall we say, unique and maybe a little surprising confections that they enjoyed back then.
Okay, I'm ready for more surprises. What else did they have up their sleeve?
Well, imagine a time before breath mints. They had these things called kissing comfits.
Kissing comfits. Okay, that name definitely has me intrigued.
Think of them as these small, sugar-coated seeds or spices, and they were often flavored with things like anise, caraway, or coriander.
So they were basically using candy to, like, freshen their breath. That's genius.
Exactly. And it gets even more interesting. These kissing comfits also had this, like, romantic connotation to them. Sharing them was a way to make yourself more appealing to, well, potential suitors.
I love that. Like, candy was a form of flirtation.
Yeah.
But what about something more substantial than those little comfits? Did they have anything, like, resembling our chocolate bars?
So while those, like, solid chocolate bars weren't common yet, chocolate was starting to make its way into, like, more solid forms.
Okay.
The video mentions chocolate cakes.
Chocolate cakes. Okay, now we're talking.
Now, don't get too excited. They're not like the decadent chocolate cakes we enjoy today.
Oh, okay.
Imagine them as these kind of dense, fudgy squares, often flavored with spices, and sometimes they'd contain nuts or dried fruits.
So kind of like a cross between, like, a brownie and a fruitcake.
That's a pretty good way to put it. But you got to keep in mind, they didn't have refined sugar or, modern chocolate making techniques back then.
Right, so the taste and texture would have been quite different.
Oh, definitely.
But I bet those chocolate cakes were still considered a real treat.
Oh, absolutely. And speaking of treats, let's talk about a category of 18th century confections that might surprise you. Candied vegetables.
Candied vegetables. Now, that's something I never would have expected.
Yeah. The most popular one was candied ginger. Technically it's a rhizome, but for our purposes, we can consider it a vegetable.
Candied ginger, I actually love that. It's got that, spicy, sweet kick. But I never thought about it as, like, a vegetable candy.
Well, back then, it was a really popular treat. Just imagine how that unique flavor would have enhanced those 18th century desserts and stuff.
Okay, so we've got candied ginger for a sweet and spicy kick. But what about something a little more, I don't know, on the tart side? Did they have anything resembling our modern, like, sour candies?
So while they didn't have those intensely sour flavors that we have today, they did have access to, tart fruits, which they used to create these various kind of sourish treats. One example is preserved barberries.
Barberries. I'm not even sure I know what those are.
They're these small, bright red berries that grow on these thorny shrubs, and they have this really tart, almost like a stringent flavor.
Okay, so not exactly the sweet, juicy berries we're used to. So how did they turn those tart berries into candy?
Well, they preserved them in sugar, just like with other fruits, right? And that sugar kind of tempered that tartness, creating this more balanced, sweet and sour flavor.
I could see how that would be, like, a nice contrast to all the other super sweet candies. It's like they instinctively understood how to balance those flavors.
Exactly. And it highlights their ingenuity and resourcefulness. They were using these limited ingredients to create all these different flavor profiles.
It's incredible how much we've learned about, like, 18th century candy from just one YouTube video.
Yeah.
It's like we've taken a time machine back to a whole different world of sweetness.
It really is remarkable how something as simple as candy can offer such a fascinating glimpse into history, isn't it?
It really is. And as we continue to explore, I'm sure we'll uncover even more intriguing insights into this 18th century confectionery landscape.
Oh, absolutely. There's so much more to discover.
Okay, so you've definitely piqued my curiosity. What other sweet surprises are in store for us?
Well, let's talk about a confection that was particularly popular among the upper classes, sugared flowers.
Sugared flowers. That sounds incredibly elegant.
They were exactly that. Delicate, visually stunning treats, often served at fancy gatherings and special occasions.
So they were literally using flowers as candy. What kind of flowers did they use? I'm having trouble picturing that.
They used a variety of edible flowers, things like violets, roses, and even lavender.
Lavender. Wow, that's unexpected.
Right.
So were these sugared flowers purely for their sweetness, or was there more to it?
They were definitely about more than just sweetness. They added a touch of fragrance and visual appeal to desserts and other dishes. Think of it like the 18th century version of edible garnishes.
I love that. Edible flowers as decoration. Sounds so beautiful and so creative.
It
So
was.
how did they make these sugared flowers? Was it a complicated process?
It was more about precision than complexity, really. So they would select, these really fresh flowers, brush them with either egg white or gum arabic, which acted like edible glue, and then sprinkle them with this finely granulated sugar, coating each petal really evenly.
Wow, that sounds like it took a lot of patience.
Oh, yeah.
What did they do with them once they were all, sugared up?
Often they would let them dry completely, which helped preserve them and make them last longer. And then they would use them to decorate desserts, add them to beverages, or even just enjoy them on their own as a delicate treat.
I love that. Taking something as simple as a flower and transforming it into this, luxurious confection. It's like
Yeah.
they were able to capture the essence of nature in this, sweet and beautiful way.
That's beautifully said. And just like with other 18th century confections, the process of sugaring flowers was really labor intensive, which reflects the value they placed on presentation and artistry, especially among those upper classes.
So we've got delicate sugared flowers for the fancy folks. But what about something a little more, well, rustic? Did they have anything like our modern, I don't know, granola bars or energy bars?
So while they didn't have granola bars in the modern sense, they did have something called marchpane, which was this really dense, chewy confection made from almonds, sugar, and sometimes other ingredients like spices or dried fruits.
Marchpane. Is that like marzipan?
Yes. Marchpane is essentially an early form of marzipan.
Oh, okay.
But unlike the smooth, moldable marzipan that we know today, marchpane was often coarser in texture and had this more intense almond flavor.
So it was like their version of a protein bar. I can just imagine people snacking on those marchpane squares while they were working or traveling.
Exactly. And just like many other 18th century confections, it was also a way to preserve those valuable almonds.
It's incredible how everything we've learned about in 18th century candy ties back to those themes of preservation, resourcefulness, and creativity. It's like they had this really deep respect for the ingredients they had access to and found all these ingenious ways to transform them into something, well, special.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another confection that might seem familiar but had a surprisingly different twist back then: lollipops.
Lollipops, I thought those were a modern invention.
Well, they didn't have those, mass-produced, brightly colored lollipops that we see today, but they did have something called sugar sticks.
Sugar sticks. So just sticks of sugar. It's pretty straightforward.
It was a simple concept, but it still required a lot of skill. They would boil sugar to this very specific temperature, then pour it onto a flat surface, often like a marble slab, and let it cool slightly. And then they'd insert this small stick, often a twig or a piece of straw, into the cooling sugar and kind of twist it to create this spiral shape.
So no fancy molds or lollipop making machines back then. It was all done by hand.
All by hand.
And what about flavors? Do they have any flavors besides plain sugar?
Of course they did. They were just as creative with their flavors back then as we are today.
Yeah.
They'd often add these natural flavors, things like fruit juices, spices, or even flower extracts to their sugar sticks.
Yeah, that's so cool. It's like they were experimenting with all sorts of flavors, just like we do today with our modern lollipops.
Exactly. It goes to show that our fascination with flavor and variety in candy has been around for centuries.
This is all so fascinating. I'm starting to see how 18th century candy wasn't just about sweetness. It was about artistry, ingenuity, and even a bit of science.
You got it. The world of 18th century confectionery was this blend of creativity, resourcefulness, and a really deep understanding of, like, sugar's properties.
It's like they were these culinary alchemists, transforming simple ingredients into this whole world of delightful and surprising treats.
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm ready for more. What other sweet secrets from the past are you ready to share?
Well, let's talk about a confection that might seem simple, yet deceptively complex: rock candy.
Rock candy? You mean like those beautiful crystallized sugar formations that look like gemstones?
That's exactly it. Rock candy has been around for centuries, and it was a popular treat in the 18th century. People enjoyed it on its own or used it to sweeten beverages.
I've always been fascinated by rock candy. It really is like edible art. But I have no idea how they actually made it back then. It seems like it would require like some sort of magic.
It does seem magical, doesn't it? But the process is actually based on a really simple, like, scientific principle: crystallization. So essentially, you create what's called a supersaturated sugar solution, meaning you dissolve as much sugar as possible in, like, hot water, and then as that solution cools, the sugar molecules start to come out of solution and, well, form crystals.
Oh, okay. I kind of remember learning about that in science class. But how do they get those like big, beautiful crystals that rock candy is known for? That's the part that seems like magical to me.
That's where the, like, artistry comes in. So they would suspend a string or a stick in that supersaturated sugar solution, and as that solution cooled, the sugar crystals would form around that string, creating those, stunning formations.
It's like growing crystals, but with sugar.
Exactly.
That's incredible. So were they limited to like plain sugar, or did they get creative with flavors too?
They definitely experimented with flavors. That's a perfect way to describe it. And just like with many other 18th century confections, butter tablet was a way to kind of showcase the wealth and hospitality of the host.
We've gone from like medicinal lollipops to indulgent butter tablets. It's amazing to see the range of confections they were creating back then. It's like we're peeling back the layers of history and discovering this whole new world of like sweetness and culinary creativity.
It's truly remarkable how something as simple as candy can offer such a rich and nuanced glimpse into the past.
I'm completely captivated by this journey through 18th century candy. What other sweet surprises are in store for us as we continue our exploration?
Well, let's talk about a confection that might seem familiar, yet surprisingly different: gummies.
Gummies? You mean those chewy, fruity candies that come in all sorts of shapes and flavors?
Not exactly. While the, like, mass-produced gummies that we know today didn't exist in the 18th century, they did have something called fruit pastes.
Fruit pastes.
Yeah.
Okay, that's intriguing. So how did they make these fruit pastes?
Very similar to how we make fruit leathers or jams today. They would boil fruit juice with sugar and sometimes a gelling agent like pectin or gelatin until it thickened into this, like, paste, and then they would spread that paste out on a flat surface and let it dry.
So kind of like a cross between like a fruit leather and a gummy candy.
Exactly. And just like with many other 18th century confections, fruit pastes were a way to preserve those flavors of fresh fruit and enjoy them year-round.
I can just imagine those fruit pastes being a real treat during like the winter months when fresh fruit was scarce.
Absolutely. And they were also, like, a really convenient and portable snack, perfect for, travelers or those on the go.
This is all so fascinating. It's like we're discovering a whole new world of candy that existed, centuries before our modern day treats.
It's a testament to the creativity and ingenuity of those early confectioners. They were able to transform simple ingredients into this wide array of, like, delicious and delightful treats.
I'm absolutely hooked on this journey through the history of candy. What other sweet secrets from the past are you ready to reveal?
Well, let's talk about a confection that might seem unusual to modern palates: candied nuts.
Candied nuts. You mean like those sweet, crunchy nuts that are often coated in sugar or spices?
Exactly. Candied nuts actually have a really long history dating back to ancient times.
Yeah.
And in the 18th century, they were a really popular treat, enjoyed on their own or used in other desserts.
I can definitely see why candied nuts are so addictive. That combination of sweet, crunchy, and salty is like irresistible. But I never thought about them from a like historical perspective.
Right. Well, in the 18th century, nuts were a valuable source of, protein and nutrients.
Yeah.
And just like with fruits, candying them was a way to preserve them and make them last longer.
That makes sense. It's like they were turning those like nutritious nuts into a sweet and satisfying treat. What kinds of nuts did they candy?
They used a variety of nuts, including, like, almonds, walnuts, hazelnuts, and even chestnuts.
Oh, chestnuts. I love roasted chestnuts, especially around the holidays. But I can't imagine them candied.
Well, chestnuts actually have this naturally sweet flavor, which made them really well suited for candying. And in the 18th century, they were a really common ingredient in both like savory and sweet dishes.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So how did they actually candy the nuts? Was it similar to, like, the process for fruits?
Yeah, the process was very similar. They would boil the nuts in sugar syrup until they were, coated and tender and then let them dry. They often added spices or flavorings to the syrup, creating a variety of like flavor
I
profiles.
can just imagine how those candied nuts would added like a delicious crunch and flavor to their desserts and other treats. It's like they were the 18th century version of sprinkles.
That's a great analogy. And just like with sprinkles, candied nuts were a way to kind of add a touch of festivity and like indulgence to their everyday lives.
This is all so fascinating. It's like we're uncovering a whole new world of candy that existed, centuries before our modern day treats.
Mhm. It's a testament to the creativity and ingenuity of those early confectioners. They were able to transform these like simple ingredients into a wide array of delicious and delightful treats.
I'm absolutely hooked on this journey through the history of candy. What other sweet secrets from the past are you ready to reveal?
Well, let's talk about a confection that was particularly popular among children sugar animals.
Sugar animals. That sounds
Huzzah.
adorable. Were they like those little animal crackers we had today?
Not quite. Sugar animals were these molded candies made from sugar and sometimes other ingredients like spices or flavorings. And they came in all sorts of shapes and sizes, from tiny birds and squirrels to larger animals like horses and lions.
Wow, that's so creative. I can just imagine how excited children would have been to receive these like sweet little creatures.
They were quite a novelty back then, and just like with other 18th century confections, sugar animals were a way to kind of combine artistry and sweetness.
So how did they actually make these sugar animals? Did they use like molds?
They did. They would create molds out of like various materials, including wood, metal, or even pottery, and then they would pour that hot sugar mixture into the molds and let it cool and harden.
It sounds like a pretty delicate process. I
Mm.
bet it took a lot of skill to create those like intricate shapes.
It definitely required a steady hand and like a keen eye for detail. And just like with other 18th century confections, sugar animals were often decorated with, colorful dyes and edible paints.
I love how they brought those little creatures to life with color. It's like they were creating like edible works of art.
Exactly. And just like with other 18th century confections, sugar animals were more than just a sweet treat. They were also a way to like express creativity and bring a touch of whimsy to everyday life.
This is all so fascinating. It's like we're peeling back the layers of history and discovering a whole new world of like sweetness and culinary creativity.
It's truly remarkable how something as simple as candy can offer such a rich and nuanced glimpse into the past.
I'm completely captivated by this journey through 18th century candy. What other sweet surprises are in store for us as we continue our exploration?
Well, let's talk about a confection that was particularly popular among the upper classes, sugar sculptures.
Sugar sculptures. That sounds incredibly elaborate.
They were exactly that. Sugar sculptures were these large, intricate works of art made entirely from sugar. They were often used as centerpieces at banquets and other like grand occasions.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine how they created such like detailed sculptures using only sugar. It seems like it would require a tremendous amount of like skill and patience.
It was a highly specialized art form, definitely. Practiced by these like skilled sugar artists who were often trained for years. They would use all sorts of techniques to manipulate the sugar, including like molding, carving, and even blowing.
Blowing sugar, like
But
blowing glass.
exactly. They would heat the sugar to this really high temperature, making it like pliable, and then use their breath to inflate it into these various shapes. It was a really delicate and kind of dangerous process requiring, great skill and precision.
I can only imagine the level of artistry involved in creating these sugar sculptures. What kinds of things did they depict?
Oh, they depicted a wide range of subjects, things like mythological figures, animals, plants, and even architectural elements. They were often incredibly detailed and lifelike, really showcasing the sugar artists' like mastery of the craft.
It sounds like they were creating like edible masterpieces. What happened to the sugar sculptures after the event? Did people actually eat them?
Sometimes, yeah, but they were often considered more of a decorative element than like a food item. So they would be displayed, for admiration and then sometimes broken apart and shared among the guests as like a special treat.
I can just imagine the excitement of receiving a piece of one of these sugar sculptures. It's like getting a piece of like edible history.
Exactly. And it really speaks to the unique role of sugar in 18th century society. It wasn't just a sweetener. It was this medium for artistic expression, a symbol of wealth and status, and a source of wonder and delight.
This is all so fascinating. I'm starting to see how like 18th century candy wasn't just about sweetness. It was about artistry, ingenuity, and even a bit of magic.
You've hit the nail on the head. The world of 18th century confectionery was this fascinating blend of creativity, resourcefulness, and a deep understanding of the chemical properties of sugar.
It's like they were these culinary alchemists,
Mm.
transforming simple ingredients into this world of delightful and surprising treats.
Precisely. And as we kind of delve deeper into this sweet historical journey, we'll uncover even more fascinating insights into the evolution of candy and its enduring appeal.
Okay, you've definitely got me craving more. What other sweet secrets from the past are you ready to share?
Well, let's revisit a confection that we touched upon earlier, sugar plums. Remember how we talked about them being more of a category than a specific candy?
Yes, I remember thinking of like those shiny round candies from "'Twas the Night Before Christmas." But you explained that sugar plums were actually like a whole assortment of sugar-coated treats.
Exactly. And it's fascinating to think about why they were so popular back then.
Hmm.
Imagine a time before modern candy making techniques when sugar was this precious commodity. Sugar plums were a way to preserve and enjoy the sweetness of fruit, nuts, and seeds.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But what exactly did they look like? Were they like those perfectly round, shiny candies that we often associate with, like sugar plums today?
Not necessarily. They could be round, but they could also be irregular in shape, depending on the ingredients used. The key element was that they were, small bite-sized treats coated in sugar.
So it's more about the concept of a sugar-coated treat than a specific shape or appearance. What kinds of ingredients did they use to make these sugar plums?
They used a wide variety of fruits, nuts, and seeds, depending on, what was available locally and seasonally. Imagine plums, cherries, apricots, almonds, hazelnuts, even caraway seeds, all coated in this layer of glistening sugar.
Wow, that's quite a range. It sounds like the 18th century version of a gourmet candy assortment.
Exactly. And each sugar plum would have had its own unique flavor and texture depending on the ingredients used. Imagine biting into a sugar plum and discovering a burst of tart cherry flavor or the crunch of a candied almond.
It sounds like a delightful sensory experience. And I love how those early confectioners were able to transform these, simple everyday ingredients into these little treasures of sweetness.
It really speaks to their creativity and ingenuity. They didn't have access to the vast array of artificial flavors and colors we have today, so they had to really rely on their knowledge of nature's bounty to create these, delicious and visually appealing treats.
This is also fascinating. It's like we're piecing together a whole new understanding of how people experience sweetness in the 18th century.
Exactly. And as we delve deeper into this sweet historical journey, we'll uncover even more intriguing insights into the evolution of candy and its enduring appeal.
Okay, you've definitely hooked me. What other sweet surprises are in store for us in this 18th century candy adventure?
Well, let's talk about a confection that was both a treat and a form of entertainment: barley sugar toys.
Barley sugar toys. That sounds intriguing. What were they?
Remember how we talked about barley sugar earlier, that
Yeah.
simple hard candy made from barley?
Yeah.
Well, confectioners actually took that basic recipe and kind of elevated it to an art form by creating these intricate toys and figures out of barley sugar.
Wow, that's amazing. I can't even imagine how they manipulated that hard candy into such, intricate shapes.
It was a really highly skilled craft. They would heat the barley sugar until it was pliable and then use tools and their bare hands to shape it into these various forms.
What kind of toys do they create?
Oh, they created everything from miniature animals and birds to dolls and even miniature furniture. It was this tiny edible world of wonder.
I can just imagine the delight on a child's face receiving one of these barley sugar toys. It's like a combination of a sweet treat and a plaything.
Exactly. And these barley sugar toys weren't just for children either. They were also popular among adults, often given as gifts or used as decorations.
Sounds like they were the 18th century version of those like fancy chocolate sculptures you see today.
That's a great comparison. And just like those chocolate sculptures, barley sugar toys were a real testament to the artistry and like skill of those early confectioners.
This is all so fascinating. It's like we're uncovering a whole new level of like creativity and sophistication in the world of like 18th century candy.
It's truly remarkable how something as simple as like sugar could be transformed into such a wide array of like delightful and artistic creations.
Okay, I'm ready for more. What other sweet secrets from the past are you ready to share?
Well, let's talk about a confection that was as much about its aroma as its taste-spiced comfits.
Spiced comfits. That sounds intriguing. What were those?
Remember how we talked about like kissing comfits earlier?
Yeah.
Those small sugar-coated seeds or spices used to like freshen breath.
Right.
Well, spiced comfits took that concept to a whole new level by incorporating a wider range of like aromatic spices.
So they were like the 18th century version of like potpourri, but edible.
Exactly. They were designed to like stimulate the senses with their vibrant colors and like intoxicating aromas.
What kinds of spices did they use?
Oh, they used a variety of, warm, fragrant spices, including like cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, cardamom, and even ginger.
Wow, that sounds like a symphony of flavors. I can just imagine the aroma of those spiced comfits filling like a whole room.
Oh, they were quite potent. And just like with other 18th century confections, spiced comfits were more than just a treat. They were also used to like mask unpleasant odors, freshen breath, and even like aid digestion.
It's like they were the 18th century version of like aromatherapy.
Exactly. And it really speaks to a time when like people had a much deeper connection to, the natural world and the power of plants and spices.
This is also fascinating. It's like we're peeling back the layers of history
Mm.
and discovering a whole new world of like sensory experiences and culinary traditions.
It's truly remarkable how something as simple as like candy can offer such a rich, nuanced glimpse into the past.
I'm completely captivated by this journey through like 18th century candy.
Mhm.
What other sweet surprises are in store for us as we continue our exploration?
Well, let's talk about a confection that was both delicate and decadent crystallized fruit.
Crystallized fruit, you mean those beautiful glistening pieces of fruit that are often used as decorations on like cakes and other desserts?
Exactly. Crystallized fruit has actually been a popular confection for centuries, and it was especially prized in the 18th century. It was a way to like preserve those flavors of fresh fruit and enjoy them year round.
I can just imagine how those like glistening pieces of fruit would have added a touch of elegance and like luxury to their desserts. What kinds of fruits did they crystallize?
They crystallize a wide variety of fruits, including like cherries, apricots, plums, pears, and even citrus fruits.
Citrus fruits. I thought those were too tart to crystallize.
Well, remember how we talked about candied citrus peel earlier?
Yeah.
They use a similar process for like crystallizing those whole citrus fruits. So they'd carefully remove the pith and seeds and then soak the fruit in water to remove some of that like bitterness. And then they would boil the fruit in sugar syrup until it became like translucent and coated in a layer of like sparkling sugar crystals.
That's incredible. It sounds like a really labor-intensive process, but the results must have been stunning.
They were truly works of art, and just like with other 18th century confections, crystallized fruit was a way to kind of showcase the wealth and sophistication of, like, the host.
I can just imagine these like beautiful crystallized fruits adorning like elaborate desserts at like grand banquets and celebrations.
Exactly, and it speaks to a time when, like, food wasn't just sustenance, it was a form of art, a symbol of status, and a way to, like, impress and delight guests.
It's amazing to think about how these seemingly simple treats were so much more than just candy. They represent like history, culture, resourcefulness, and artistry.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's fascinating how exploring something like, 18th century candy can provide such a, like, unique window into the past.
I'm ready to continue this delicious journey. What other sweet surprises do you have in store for us?
Let's talk about a confection that was as much about its aroma as its taste sucket.
Sucker, like a lollipop.
Not quite. While it does sound similar, sucket was actually a type of candied fruit or root. Think of things like cherries, plums, ginger, or even angelica, all like beautifully preserved in sugar.
So similar to the crystallized fruit we just discussed, but maybe with a slightly different process.
You're on the right track. The main difference is that with sucket, they involved like repeatedly boiling that fruit or root in sugar syrup, allowing it to dry between each boil. And this created a really intense, concentrated flavor and a firm, almost chewy texture.
It sounds like they were really dedicated to like extracting all those like delicious flavors and preserving them.
Exactly. And they didn't stop there. They often added spices and flavorings to the sugar syrup, creating, even more complex flavor profiles. Imagine like the taste of candied ginger infused with the warmth of cinnamon or the subtle like floral notes of rose water.
That sounds incredible. I'm starting to understand that 18th century confectionery was this like world of flavor exploration. They weren't afraid to experiment and create something truly unique.
You're absolutely right. And speaking of unique, let's talk about a confection that was both visually striking and incredibly labor intensive to create: spun sugar.
Spun sugar, like those like delicate, airy strands of sugar that look like cobwebs.
That's exactly it. Spun sugar was considered a true, like, luxury in the 18th century, often gracing the tables of the wealthy and, like, appearing at special occasions.
I can see why it's so delicate and beautiful, but I can't even imagine how they created those like intricate designs.
It was a really skilled craft, requiring a lot of practice and, like, patience. The confectioner would heat sugar to a high temperature and then use a fork or spoon to, like, drizzle it onto a cold surface, creating these thin, thread-like strands.
It sounds like they were almost painting with sugar.
That's a great way to put it. They would carefully layer those strands, building up these intricate shapes and designs. Imagine like delicate birds, flowers, baskets, and even crowns, all crafted from like glistening spun sugar.
It sounds like edible art. Did they like flavor spun sugar or was it purely about like the visual appeal?
While the visual appeal was a huge part of its allure, they did sometimes add flavors and colors to the sugar. Imagine a delicate, like, spun sugar rose with a hint of rose water, or a vibrant yellow spun sugar bird with a touch of lemon zest.
It's amazing to think about like how much detail and artistry went into creating these confections.
Absolutely. And it's another example of how 18th century confectioners were really pushing the boundaries of what was possible with sugar. They were transforming it from a simple sweetener into a medium for artistic expression and a symbol of luxury and celebration.
This has been such an incredible journey through the world of like 18th century candy.
Yeah.
I'm constantly amazed by the ingenuity and resourcefulness of like those early confectioners.
It's truly fascinating to see how they took like simple ingredients and, using techniques passed down through generations, created such a wide array of delightful and surprising treats.
We've covered everything from medicinal lollipops to like spun sugar masterpieces. What other sweet adventures await us as we continue to delve into this like delicious history? I feel like we've like only just scratched the surface of this sugary world. What else can you share about the amazing creativity of those 18th century confectioners?
Well, let's talk about a confection that might surprise you with its versatility: icing. We tend to think of icing as simply like a topping for cakes and pastries, but in the 18th century, it was so much more than that.
Really? Icing was more than just a topping. I'm intrigued. How else did they use it?
Icing was actually a way to preserve, decorate, and even add flavor to a wide variety of foods. Like they used it to coat fruits, nuts, even meats.
Whoa.
Imagine a beautiful glazed ham glistening with this like sweet and savory icing, or, a delicate fruit tart adorned with like intricate icing designs.
Wow, it's amazing. It's like icing was the 18th century equivalent of like a multi-purpose culinary tool.
Yeah.
And speaking of like multi-purpose, didn't they use shucks for some pretty unusual things back then?
You're right. Sugar played this surprisingly diverse role in 18th century life. It wasn't just a sweetener, like it was used in medicine, as we discussed, but also as a preservative, a decorative element, and even as like a symbol of wealth and status.
I'm starting to see how sugar was almost like, I don't know, like a magical ingredient back then. It was so much more than just something to like make things sweet.
Exactly. And that brings us to a confection that perfectly embodies that sense of like magic and wonder-preserved fruit in syrup.
Preserved fruit in syrup. That sounds delicious. Was it similar to the fruit paste we talked about earlier?
It's a similar concept, but instead of like boiling the fruit down into a paste, they would preserve whole fruits or like pieces of fruit in a sweet, flavorful syrup. Imagine jars filled with like glistening cherries, plums, apricots, or even exotic fruits like, I don't know, pineapples, all bathed in this rich syrup infused with spices and like aromatics.
That sounds incredibly luxurious. Like a taste of summer preserved in a jar. I can just imagine how special those jars of like preserved fruit would have been, especially during the winter months when fresh fruit was scarce.
They were definitely considered like a special treat, often reserved for special occasions or given as gifts. And it's another example of how those early confectioners were like masters of preservation, transforming seasonal abundance into, year-round delights.
It's incredible to think about how resourceful they were, using those preservation techniques to create such a diverse and delicious array of confections. It really challenges like our modern perception of candy as, simply a sugary treat.
You're absolutely right. This deep dive has really revealed how, 18th century candy was so much more than just like a sweet indulgence. It was intertwined with medicine, food preservation, artistry, and even like social customs.
It's been an amazing journey through like a world of sweetness I never knew existed. I feel like I have a whole new appreciation for the history of candy and the incredible creativity of those like early confectioners.
And hopefully, this deep dive will inspire you to look at those everyday treats we often take for granted with a newfound sense of wonder and curiosity. Who knows what other sweet secrets are waiting to be uncovered in the annals of history?
I'm already eager for our next deep dive, but for now I'll be savoring all the delicious knowledge we've uncovered about the fascinating world of 18th century candy.